Hey, greetings everybody. Gleekon here with another episode of Lore of Warcraft coming at you. We are on the chapter 4 of the Sundering. In our most recent chapters, we had Maev Shadow Song join up, and she seems kind of jerky, but you know that's a little bit true to form for her. We also have Illidan has recently had his eyeballs burned out, and we've learned that while captured, Tyrande is being protected by Elune. Whoever Elune is, she does have the power at least to protect Tyrande, so there's that. Alright, so stay a while in listen. Chapter 4. She had not been fed, but Tyrande did not yet feel hunger. Elune still filled her with the moon goddess's love, nourishment enough for anyone. Yeah, that's all I need. The moon goddess's love, and I don't need to eat anymore. How long that would last, however, was an important question. The dire forces raised by the demons and the highborn grew with every passing moment, and in addition, the priestess sensed some other darker presence as well. It did not seem a part of the Burning Legion's plan, but worked alongside it. Perhaps such a notion was only the first sign of coming madness, but Tyrande could not help wondering if the demons were being manipulated, just as they were manipulating the queen. Maybe. Someone worked on the door. Tyrande's brow furrowed. She had heard no marching. Whoever was out in the corridor had come in utter silence. Moreover, she realized that the guards had grown extremely quiet over the past several minutes. The door slid open. Tyrande tried to think who had come in such secrecy. Illidan? But it was not Malfurion's brother who slipped inside. Rather, it was the noble who acted as Ajara's chief handmaiden. The other night Elf glanced up with guarded eyes at the captive, then turned to make certain that the door closed without a sound. As she did, Tyrande could not help notice no guards visible outside. Were they simply out of sight, or entirely gone? Looking at her, the handmaiden smiled. If it was meant to comfort Tyrande, it did not entirely succeed. "I am Lady Vaj," the newcomer reminded her. "You are a priestess of Elune." "I am Tyrande Whisperwind." Vaj nodded absently. "I have come to help you escape." Tyrande instinctively thanked the Mother Moon. She had misjudged Vaj, thinking her a jealous sycophant of the queen. Stepping as close as she could, Vaj continued. "I've taken a talisman that can open the sphere around you and release you from the demon's spell. You can also use it to ward off their notice as I have. I am grateful, but why risk this?" "You are a priestess of Elune," returned the other female. "How could I do otherwise?" Vaj revealed the talisman. It was a grotesque black circle with tiny cruel skulls lining the edge. From the center thrust up a 6-inch point with ebony jewels at the base. Tyrande sensed both its magic and its evil. "Be prepared," the handmaiden commanded. "Obey me in all things if you hope to no longer be the demon's prisoner." She reached up and touched the point to the green sphere. The jewels flashed. The diminutive skulls opened their macabre jaws and hissed. The sphere was sucked into the tiny maws. Tyrande felt the spell holding her dissipate. She suddenly had to twist in the air to keep from falling face first. The priestess landed on the stone floor in a crouched position. To her surprise, Tyrande felt no pain from the landing, Elune's touch still protecting her. Vaj glanced with frustration at her. With the sphere gone, Tyrande now faintly glowed with moonlight arising from within. The handmaiden shook her head. "You must not remain like that. It will give you away once out of this cell." Closing her eyes, Tyrande prayed to her goddess, thanking the Mother Moon for her protection, but assuring her that this was now for the best. At first, however, it seemed as if Elune paid her no mind, for she felt the protective spell remain fixed. "Hurry!" Lady Vaj urged. Yeah, this does not. I don't. Eyes still shut, Tyrande tried again. Surely the Mother Moon understood that now the very gift she had bestowed upon her servant risked the priestess. At last, Elune's presence began to recede, and a sense of imminent threat overwhelmed Tyrande. She opened her eyes to see Vaj thrusting at her throat with the sinister talisman. The dagger-like protrusion would have ripped a wide, lethal gap if not for the war training all priestesses received. Tyrande's hand came up just in time to shove the point aside. She felt the stinging on her skin, but had managed to keep Vaj from even drawing blood. Ajara's servant, her expression as monstrous as those of the skulls, sought to tear out Tyrande's eyes with her free hand. The priestess raised her armored knee, catching Vaj in the stomach. With a gasp, the other night elf fell back, the talisman rolling to the side. Tyrande leapt at her, but Vaj was also swift. She rolled over to where the talisman had landed. Tyrande, crouching, tried to pull her back, but the treacherous handmaiden already had the demonic artifact in her clutches. She spewed unintelligible words of an overt, dark tone as she pointed the talisman. The sphere suddenly reformed around Tyrande. At the same time, the priestess felt Elun's protection return, though small good it did to help her escape the bubble. Tyrande beat against the sphere, but to no avail. Rising Lady Vaj glared bitterly at her nemesis. "It would have been better for you if you had taken the point. You'll never be her most favored. I am and always will be." "I don't want to be favored by the queen." But Vaj seemed not to understand this. Eyes on the talisman, she hissed, "I thought this would work, but I'll have to think of something else. Perhaps words in the light of lights, dear. Convince her that you are not to be trusted. Yes, that might do the trick." Tyrande ceased trying to convince the handmaiden of her lack of desire to serve Ajara. Clearly Vaj was quite mad and would hear nothing that contradicted her notions. A sound from without made Vaj spin to the door. "The guards! They will be back from their distraction." Looking back at the prisoner, she pointed the talisman again. "Everything must be as it was." Once more, Tyrande's arms rose, invisibly binding at the wrist. Her feet clamped tight together. "Would that I knew more about this piece," Vaj spat. "I know it could likely slay you, with but the right command." The sounds without drew nearer. Secreting the talisman in a fold in her garments, Ajara's attendant made for the door. As she slipped out, she looked one last time at Tyrande. "Never hers." With that, Vaj vanished into the hall. The guards reappeared barely moments later. One peered through the mesh grate in the door and eyed her for far longer than necessary. What she could make of his expression indicated that he was disturbed by her presence. Vaj had clearly not acted alone. As for Tyrande, she could do nothing but berate herself for a chance lost. It should have been obvious to her that Vaj could not be trusted, but Elun had taught that one should look for the best in others. Yet if Tyrande had acted with more caution, perhaps she could have caught the handmaiden off guard. Instead of being again trapped here, at least then the priestess could have tried to sneak out of the palace. "Mother Moon, what do I do?" She was aware that there were limits to the goddess's ability to intervene. It was miracle enough that Elun had protected her so. Malfurion's visage came to mind, both comforting Tyrande and making her fret. He would not give up trying to save her. He would come for her regardless of the danger to himself. In fact, she was well aware that Malfurion would be willing to sacrifice himself if it meant her freedom. And it seemed Tyrande Whisperwind thought with growing despair that there would be nothing she in turn could do to prevent him from doing so. The small copse of woods was the best Malfurion could do in terms of finding a peaceful place from which to try to reach Cenarius. The druid sat cross-legged on the ground, glancing again at the pitiful foliage around him. The Burning Legion had not reached this place, but their taint had stretched for enough to affect the life here. The trees already sensed the doom approaching and slowly prepared for it. Most of the wildlife had fled. Silence reigned. Trying to ignore all that, Malfurion shut his eyes and fixed on the demigod. He reached out, calling to Cenarius and trying to picture the deity in his thoughts. And to his surprise, the demigod responded immediately. An image formed of the Forest Lord, a huge figure who towered over night elves, tauren, furbolgs, and even the demons. At first glance, he had some similarity to Malfurion, for his face and torso were like those of a night elf, albeit much brawnier and more weathered. Yet beyond that, Cenarius was a creature like none other. Below his waist, he had the body of a gigantic, magnificent stag. 4 strong legs, ending in hooves, supported his 10-foot frame. They gave him the speed of the wind and a nimbleness no animal could match. Cenarius had eyes of pure gold and a moss-green mane flowing down his shoulders. In both it and his full beard grew twigs and leaves. Atop his head, and exactly Malfurion noted at the start where his own nubs grew, the Forest Lord had a glorious pair of antlers. "I know why you've summoned me," the demigod said. "Is there anything I could do to counteract and outmaneuver the Black Dragon's magic?" "He is cunning, insanely so," Cenarius replied, his mouth never moving. He was but a vision upon which the druid could focus, nothing more. The true Forest Lord was miles away, but there are things I know of dragonkind that he may not realize. Malfurion did not press on how Cenarius might know these things. From what he had learned, the deity was likely the offspring of the green dragon Ysera, she of the dreaming. Those kind most inhabited the Emerald Dream. That the great aspect might have taught her son its innermost secrets would not have surprised the night elf.
The Emerald Dream has layers, Malfurion, levels upon levels. She of the Dreaming discovered these through experience. The Earth Warder likely will not know of them. You may be able to use such a path to circumvent his defenses and keep from his attention for a time.
This was something unexpected. Malfurion's hopes rose. Should he succeed in this, perhaps he could use such a method to infiltrate the palace. But he had to concentrate on one matter at a time. While his heart yearned to rescue Tyrande, the fate of all his people and the Tauren, Earthen, and others was of far more consequence. She would have been the first to tell him so. It did not make his feeling of guilt any less.
Can I quickly learn how to do this?
He asked of the demigod.
You, yes, it is only a matter of perspective. See?
The image gestured, and around the pair an idyllic landscape appeared. It was without imperfection. Malfurion recognized hills and valleys that in the mortal plane had been ravaged beyond recognition by the Burning Legion. The Emerald Dream was as the world had been upon its creation. The druid looked but saw nothing he had not already experienced previous.
You note the culmination, but even perfection comes in stages. Behold.
Cenarius reached down, his hand gigantic as it touched the pristine world. The Forest Lord seized a bit of field and seemed to flip the entire landscape over. It vanished as he released his grip, and in its place was again a primitive Kalimdor, but a Kalimdor in which some new subtle differences from the previous landscape could be seen. Hills were not as large in some places, and a river Malfurion did not know flowed into quite the same... A river Malfurion knew did not flow into quite the same region as before. There was a small mountain chain where plains should have existed.
Before the creation, there was the growth, the testing, the earlier stages. This is one.
It was and was not the Emerald Dream. The druid recognized immediately that this was a place of limited scope, and therefore use, a Kalimdor that would not enable him to reach every location existing on the mortal plane. Yet Cenarius believed it could help him with the Black Dragon. The looming figure of the woodland deity pointed off in the distance.
Walk it as you would the other Malfurion, but remain clear of its edges. It is an incomplete place, and to wander off it could mean being lost in an endless limbo. I speak of this from dread experience.
Cenarius said no more, but his meaning was clear. If Malfurion lost his way, there would be no rescue. Despite that dread knowledge, the Night Elf was determined to continue on.
How do I return? As you always have. Seek to follow your way back to your physical self. The path will become known to you.
All so simple, providing one had the training as he did. Cenarius' image began to fade. Malfurion stopped him.
The others,
he said, referring to the Forest Lord's fellow demigods.
Have you been able to convince them? Eviana has spoken alongside me. The die is cast. We must now only decide how.
Malfurion barely checked his disappointment. He had been pressing for the demigods to take a more active part in the host's desperate efforts, and while Cenarius had just indicated that his fellows had agreed to do so, now they would debate the manner. With such beings, that debate might last long past the struggle. Kalimdor could be an empty, dead shell before then.
Fear not, Malfurion, the Forest Lord said, smiling knowingly. I shall endeavor to hasten their decision.
The druid had left open his innermost thoughts, a beginner's mistake.
Forgive me, I meant no disrespect.
Cenarius, already fading, shook his antlered head. He pointed a finger which ended in a gnarled talon of wood, and concluded,
There is no disrespect in trying to urge those suffering from sloth to fulfill their duties.
With that, the stag god vanished. The druid had expected to return to his body and inform the others of what he had learned, but the unfinished landscape Cenarius had revealed to him already lay open. Malfurion feared that if he took the time to first return to the mortal plane, it might prove more difficult than the demigod believed for him to find his way back to this version of early Kalimdor. Unwilling to check his impulse any longer, he leapt. As with the path Malfurion usually took, the hazy emerald light still pervaded everything. In truth, he could not tell any difference between one place and another, save for the occasional variation in features. Over hills and valleys and plains, Malfurion flew. From Krasis, he knew the general direction where the dragons tended to live. Obviously, the Earth Warder would not maintain his sanctum so near the others, but Krasis had assured him that the ancient race were creatures of habit. If the druid began his hunt near the ancestral grounds, there was a good chance he might discover something. The land below became more mountainous, yet these peaks were neither the perfectly pointed ones of his past journeys into the dream realm, nor were they the weathered ones of the mortal plane. Instead, they were, as Cenarius had hinted, unfinished. One peak literally lacked its northern face, the earth and rock looking as if some great knife had sheared it off. Malfurion could see the veins of minerals and bits of caverns within. Another peak had a peculiar crown that made it appear as if someone had been molding it like clay, but had lost interest. Tearing his eyes from such fascinating displays, the druid inspected the area as a whole. This was definitely part of the Dragonlands. Now all he had to do was find some trace of Neltharion. As with from the other level, Malfurion probed with his senses for the Black Dragon's particular trace. He detected others and quickly identified Ysera and one he believed to be Alexstrasza. Other fainter traces Malfurion determined to be from lesser dragons and therefore not of interest. Moving slowly along, the druid searched in every direction. With each failure, he began to wonder if perhaps Neltharion had not been so naive after all. Perhaps the Black Leviathan was more familiar with this plane than Cenarius knew and had shielded himself. If so, Malfurion could wander forever and not find a single hint. He suddenly halted. A trace that he had offhandedly rejected as belonging to a minor dragon suddenly caught his attention again. It had a familiarity to it that should not have been possible. Malfurion focused on it. The facade peeled away almost immediately. Neltharion's trace lay revealed to the druid. Spells that likely would have kept the Earth Warder hidden from anyone on either the mortal plane or even in the Emerald Dream had proven almost laughably weak here. However, Malfurion tried not to grow overconfident. It was one thing to track the Black Dragon, another to keep from his notice no matter on what plane. The madness-inflicting Neltharion had given him an extreme paranoia that had augmented his higher senses. Even the slightest mistake by the druid might mean discovery. With the need for utmost caution in mind, Malfurion followed the trace. It took him further on, toward a region where the landscape became more vague, more undefined. Recalling Cenarius' warnings concerning the edges, the druid slowed. The Black Dragon was near. Malfurion sensed him just where the mountains began to blur. He also sensed something else, a foul taint that permeated the region and felt far older than anything else. It reminded the druid of what he had felt when probing deep into the demon soul. It had not only been imbued with Neltharion's madness, but something more sinister. Then, though, it had only been a trace, and he had thought little of it. What could it be? Deciding that he could not worry about it now, Malfurion ventured closer. The landscape rippled, and suddenly his dream form re-entered the mortal plane. The huge cavern surrounding him was like a scene out of some nightmare. Noxious-looking clouds of green-gray gas shot up from huge molten pits dotting the floor. The pits bubbled and hissed, and now and then their steaming contents boiled over, spilling across the already scorched stone. The volcanic activity filled the cavern with a fiery, bloody light and created macabre dancing shadows. Truly a fitting home for the beast that had slaughtered so many with so little regard. There's a lot of typos in this. It's like the third or fourth I've seen in this chapter alone. We need an editor. Come on, guys. Malfurion suddenly realized that, in addition to the bubbling and hissing, another sound constantly ranged in the background. Hammering. The more he concentrated, the more the druid realized that it was not simply one hammer, but many, and that there were other sounds of activity as well. Voices, constantly jabbering voices. Drawn by it, Malfurion's dream form flew through solid rock yards thick. The sounds reverberated through the mountain. It became an incessant barrage of work-related noises as if a huge smithy existed within the mountains. Then the rock gave way to a scene that made the volcanic pits tranquil in comparison. Goblins. The wiry creatures ran about everywhere. Some worked at huge vats and ovens, pouring steaming liquid metal into massive rectangular molds. Others beat with well-worn hammers on hot plates that looked almost like armor for some gargantuan warrior. Scores more hammered out huge bolts. All the while, they all jabbered with one another. Everywhere Malfurion looked, goblins worked on some project or another. A few in grimy smocks wandered about, directing efforts and now and then urging on the slothful with flat-handed slaps on the back with their green pointy-eared heads. And yet we have no idea how goblins came into existence. Aware that this could not be a task with good intentions behind it, he floated closer. Yet despite what he saw, Malfurion could not figure out what the goblins planned.
"Meklo!"
roared a thunderous voice suddenly.
"Meklo, attend me!"
The druid froze in midair, briefly overcome by panic. He knew well that voice, as did anyone who had survived the first use of the demon soul, and a moment later from another cavern corridor the Black Dragon himself emerged. Malfurion quickly moved behind one of the ovens. While he should have been invisible even to Neltharion, past experience had proven that the mad beast could still sense him at times. The path Cenarius had shown Malfurion had enabled the druid to slip past Neltharion's protective spells as planned, but in order to properly search for the artifact, the Night Elf unfortunately had to stay as close to the mortal plane as possible. After a brief hesitation, the goblins continued their work, albeit with not quite so much chattering. Neltharion surveyed the area, seeking out the Meklo he desired to see. If anything, the Leviathan looked even more monstrous than when he had flown from the scene of destruction. His body was distorted, bloated, and his eyes held a more horrible madness than ever. More shocking, the rips and tears in his scaled flesh had only grown, fire and molten fluids constantly gushing from each pulsating wound. It almost looked as if eventually Neltharion's body would tear itself apart. But all thought of the terrifying transformation wrought upon the black dragon vanished from Malfurion's thoughts when he saw what the giant held tight in one huge paw. The demon soul. Malfurion wanted to fly up to the dragon and steal away the golden disc, but that would not only have been impossible, it would also have been suicidal. All he could do for the moment was watch and wait.
Meklo!
Neltharion roared again. His tail came down with a massive thump, causing several of the goblins to jump in fright. But one who appeared unperturbed by this display was a spindly elder goblin with a tuft of gray fur atop his head and an extremely distracted expression. As he passed where Malfurion hid, the druid could hear him muttering about measurements and calculations. The goblin nearly walked up to Neltharion's lowered head before finally glancing at his master.
Yes, my lord Neltharion. Yes.
Meklo, my body screams. It cannot contain my glory by itself anymore. When will you be ready?
I have had to recalculate, recalibrate, and reconsider every aspect of what you need, my lord. This will require much caution, or we may bring further disaster upon you.
The dragon's snout thrust against the goblin, almost bowling Meklo over.
I want it ready. Now!
By all means,
Meklo stepped out of biting range.
Please, let me look over the latest plate.
The goblin squinted, gazing at Neltharion's paw.
But, my lord, I did warn you, that holding the disc while in this present state amplifies the effect on you. You really need to put it elsewhere until we made you over.
Never. I'll never let it leave me.
Meklo stood his ground.
My lord, if you don't put it aside, your present condition will consume you, and then anyone can take it from your burnt bones.
His words finally registered with the dragon. Neltharion snarled, then reluctantly nodded.
Very well, but the plates had better be ready, goblin, or I'll be having a snack.
His head bobbing up and down quickly, Meklo blurted,
Most assuredly, Lord Neltharion, most assuredly.
Daring his master's further wrath, he added,
Remember, it must remain on the mortal plane. Your initial use of it unbound the spells more than we expected. The new spell work needs several more days to bind to the physical shell before we can guarantee that such a thing will never happen again.
I understand that. I understand.
With a hiss, the black leviathan angrily turned about and headed back into the corridor. Malfurion tensed. The dragon was going to secrete, should be secret, the demon soul somewhere. Now was the druid's opportunity to discover the location. Ignoring the goblins, Malfurion carefully drifted after the Earth Warder. Neltharion's great girth filled the tunnel, allowing the druid no manner by which to see what might lay ahead unless he chose to fly around or through the dragon. Aware of the risks in that, the night elf forced himself to be patient. That patience wore thin as Neltharion wended his way through a labyrinth of tunnels. The sense of ancient evil the druid had earlier felt only increased as he journeyed. Where Neltharion went was clearly shunned by others. Only once did the Earth Warder pass one of his own flight, that much smaller dragon prostrating himself before his master. Beyond that, no life, not even an earthworm, appeared. The Earth Warder was taking no chances. His obsession with the demon soul included distrust of even his own followers. Not entirely surprising considering the power the disc granted its wielder. Malfurion gradually moved nearer, finally ending up just above the dragon's sweeping tail. He all but urged the Leviathan to haste. The giant abruptly paused, his head twisting to look over his shoulders. Malfurion instinctively flew into the nearest wall, sinking deep into the stone. He waited for several seconds, then dropping to a lower point, thrust his head out to look. Neltharion was already on his way. Cursing his overreaction, the druid gave chase. Scarcely had he caught up when the Earthwarder suddenly veered into a narrow cavern. It was all Neltharion could do just to fit into it, the sides of his huge torso scraping the walls.
Here,
He muttered, apparently speaking to his creation.
you'll be safe here.
The sense of dread had grown more so, but Malfurion fought down the desire to flee. He almost knew where and how the dragon hid the demon soul. With great delicacy, Neltharion reached up and took hold of a tiny outcropping. As he did, it flashed, and the piece he removed left behind in its wake a gap, clearly gouged out by some great creature, likely the dragon himself. Neltharion eyed the demon soul, then with much hesitation he gently set it into the hole. The moment he had, he thrust the false rock back in front. Again there was a flash, and now the area looked completely normal. Had he floated directly in front of it, Malfurion could have never guessed that it was not. The false covering had fashioned itself perfectly to fit its surroundings. Of more interest than even that, however, was that Malfurion could now not sense the disk. Its foul energies were invisible to even the most careful search. The dragon might not have been able to hide it beyond the mortal plane, but clearly had devised the next best thing. Neltharion paused, eyes still fixed on the spot where he had secreted the demon soul. One great paw reached up again, the sharp claws but inches from the false front. With another frustrated hiss, the black leviathan suddenly lowered his paw and began backing out of the cavern. The druid sank into the stone again, waiting until he was certain that he had given Neltharion enough time to depart. Seconds passed like hours. Finally satisfied that the dragon had to be gone, the night elf peered out. Seeing that the cavern was empty, Malfurion then drifted toward where the demon soul lay. Even almost pressed up against the false front, he felt nothing. Despite his desire to be away from this cursed place, Malfurion decided to take one look at the disk to make certain that he knew everything necessary concerning it and its whereabouts. Krasis would have questions. He leaned forward, his dream form slipping through Neltharion's camouflaged vault. A savage roar filled the cavern. The demon soul forgotten, Malfurion flung himself deep into the wall, soaring several yards through before daring to pause. He felt an intense, monstrous force probe the area, seeking whatever did not belong. Though it had not so far touched Malfurion, the night elf already recognized the black dragon as its source. Neltharion had evidently detected something amiss. However, from the vague, sweeping movement of his search, he did not know what it was. The druid stood frozen, uncertain whether it was better to try to leave or to remain where he floated. The magical probe swept closer, but again passed the night elf by. Malfurion started to relax, then suddenly felt the dragon reaching out directly at him. The druid immediately pulled back farther. Neltharion's search retreated. The dragon had again missed him. But the night elf dared not risk himself any more. He had discovered the whereabouts of the disk. As for the Earthwarder, he might be suspicious, but it was doubtful that he realized someone had actually been nearby. Malfurion retreated from the caverns, from the mountains. As he left the latter, he sought for the unfinished world within the Emerald Dream. Only when he had re-entered it did the druid feel any sense of security. That sense of security vanished as he once again felt Neltharion's overwhelming presence. The dragon knew of the Dream Realm's layers. The night elf desperately concentrated, focusing all his will on his mortal shell. He imagined returning to it, even as he felt the Earthwarder reach out in his direction. And just when he thought the mad beast had him, Malfurion awoke. "He's shaking," Ronan blurted it from the night elf's left, "and drenched with sweat." "Malfurion," Krasis filled the druid's gaze. "What ails you? Speak."
I'm all right." He paused to catch his breath. "Neltharion, he almost noticed me, but I evaded him."
"You've already gone in search of him. You were not to do that."
The opportunity arose.
"Now I'll be warned," Ronan muttered.
Perhaps not.
The human's former mentor returned.
More likely he will chalk it up to the many shadows he thinks surround him.
To Malfurion, the mage asked,
"Did you recover the demon soul? Did you discover the demon soul?"
"Yes, I know where it is,"
the druid managed to answer. He saw again Neltharion, the savage draconian face giving him chills.
"I'm only afraid that we might not be able to take it from him."
"But we have to,"
Krasis said, nodding understanding over Malfurion's concern.
"But we have to, no matter what the cost."
Okay, so no cool new skills other than deeper Emerald Dream travel unlocked for Krasis. For Malfurion. But they've discovered the location of the Demon Soul, and either Illidan's going to have to do the same thing on his own, or Illidan and Malfurion are going to team up at some point. Which, at this point, I don't see the road to that, because we know... I'm pretty sure Illidan has to get it and try and use it. And he's key to the Sundering, I believe. So, maybe there's going to be a team up. All right, guys, another episode in the pipes, 5x5. Thank you, as always, for listening, and I will catch you on the next episode of Lore of Warcraft.